Ladies and gentlemen, the session 3 will get started soon. The speaker is Assistant Professor SAVSKI, and the moderator is Professor Zhou Wenli from Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at National Cheng Kung University. Now we leave time to Professor Zhou.
Hello everyone. I'm honored to present the speakers today. Professor Kristof SAVSKI. Professor SAVSKI is an assistant professor of linguistics in the Department of Foreign Language, Faculties of Liberal Arts from Princess of Songkhla University in Thailand. His research interests are in the fields of social linguistics, applied linguistics, critical discourse studies, and language policy. A large segment of his current work revolves around the relationship between globalization and language policy, focusing in particular on global language policy regimes and their local impact. A specific focus has been on CEFR, the topic we've been listening to the whole morning. And this line of research has led him to reflect on the paradoxes faced by English language teaching practitioners. I don't know about you, but I'm very excited to listen to the finding and result around this. I know all of you must realize how productive Professor SAVSKI is, and his publication list goes on. However, since the time allotted for this section is limited. So without further ado, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone, let's welcome Professor Kristof SAVSKI.
Hello. Thank you very much, Prof. Zhou, for that really kind introduction. And let me start also by saying thank you very much for the invitation to join this really fascinating event. Yeah, very, very grateful to be here. Okay, so yes, this is my title. So I'm speaking to you from Thailand. So Sawadee everyone. And I'll talk to you about, the challenges and the opportunities that Thailand, and also I'll talk about other contexts, have faced when working with global policy like Common European Framework. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about what is my perspective here, because I think that's quite important to say. So I'm a language policy scholar. That is my kind of main area of work. So I'm a person who studies policy, not so much a policy maker, at least not, in sitting in committees at the national level. So I should say, first of all, that, I'm not here to represent a government point of view or anything like that. I'm an observer of policy processes. Otherwise, I'm applied sociolinguist, I guess I would say these days. Yeah, so sociolinguistics is kind of where I started off. And now I sort of move more toward this applied direction. I'm also a practitioner, really, in English language teaching and testing, located in a multilingual context. So the city where I'm coming to you from, Hat Yai, I'm showing it to you here on in this map. It's maybe worth pointing out, so quite far away from Bangkok, actually. We are very close, actually, to the border with Malaysia, yeah. And there is also a lot of cultural connection with Malaysia. We have Malay-speaking community close to Hat Yai. We have also historically Chinese-speaking community in Hat Yai. So it's a quite diverse context in that sense. But of course, as you can also see, I am not Thai. Yeah, I'm obviously European. I'm originally from Slovenia. And while I've been, working in Thailand for about 8.5 years now, before that, I was living in Europe for 27 years. So in the end, that does influence my point of view and how I look at the Common European Framework in particular. I want to give you a bit of prehistory when it comes to the Common European Framework in Thailand, or CEFR, yeah? So, historically, the place of English in Thailand was, we can say, rather limited, yeah? And I am talking here about English because in Thailand, Common European Framework is an English language policy in particular. Thailand was politically not integrated in any English-speaking colonial empire, right? So English was always kind of that stereotypical foreign language. And, at the very beginnings, it was an elite language. It was for people who have intercultural contacts, yeah? Now, in recent decades, there's been a shift toward English as a kind of primary foreign language, and even in some cases, almost seen as a kind of desired second language, yeah? From the perspective of, and very similar to the debate that you're having now in Taiwan, yeah? There have been talks about, a bilingual policy, yeah, as well in Thailand. So and through this sort of shift toward this whether explicit or implicit focus on Thai as national language and English as the international language, we've seen backgrounding of other European languages which used to play a kind of role in education. So German, French, Spanish, becoming less popular, and other Asian languages sort of having limited emergence. Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, Korean, these are actually languages that have culturally quite high relevance, but they are at the moment maybe still sort of segregated to, special interests. So they are elective courses in university programs, in some schools as well, but they are not, they are nowhere near they have nowhere near the spread that English has in education now. So English is now, the primary compulsory foreign language for all students at all levels of education in Thailand, practically from preschool to university level. Yeah, and let's say the history here is coming from the perspective of searching for more effective approaches to English language education. So meaning, looking for sort of in this sort of aim to spread English to society, looking for what will make this happen. And in the background here is this sort of long-term search or attempted shift from form focus to communicative teaching, something that is really not unique to Thailand. Yeah, we can see all around Asia this sort of tension between do we go to form, do we teach grammar, or do we teach this kind of communicative, and what form of communicative. In the past, there's been in this name also adoption of new curricula. Yeah, so before CEFR, there were adoption of curricular models from the US, for example, in terms of the way that language goals were set, standards-based curriculum model, that kind of thing. And of course, maybe the latest phenomenon here is the spread of CLIL, so content language integrated learning, and also EMI, English medium programs. That's sort of the latest push in particularly in basic education, going toward again promoting English. So just to give you a bit of history, right, the sort of how the CEFR comes in, the sort of first real sort of policy that introduces CEFR, this is coming from 2014, so it's much later than the two contexts that have already been introduced, Japan and Vietnam. So 2014 is the publication of this text that you can see here, which is CEFR Manual for Teachers. And what this basically was like an introduction, but it was in many ways a translation, of the CEFR into Thai according to sort of different skills, and kind of mapping onto different goals, let's say, for different educational levels, and also kind of an explanation of it through the perspective of communicative language teaching, which was the approach that was being promoted at the time. Another key text the year after that was the National Education Plan, which is a 25-year sort of philosophy for education that the government adopted at the time. And this did a couple of things, but one of the things that it did is it set the desired targets for the 20-year period in five-year breaks. And I will come back to this in a further slide. Finally, after that, we also get, since I'm working in higher education, we also get a policy to require the use of CEFR in higher education institutions, which is basically it's framed as a bigger policy guidelines to improve English in higher education. But let's say one of the provisions at the very end is that standardized English language tests must be administered and that these have to be aligned to the Common European Framework or other standards, it says here. But seeing that the Common European Framework was basically compulsory or interpreted as being compulsory in this sense. So this is kind of the timeline. It's a little bit, starting a little bit from the bottom or from the mid-scale, and then going to the top and then sort of going back to the bottom. And that is, let's say, maybe just the messiness or of normal policy, I would say. Yeah? Now, I will talk about kind of three directions of policy making in, or the way that CEFR has been used in the Thai context. So, I'll talk about the use in policy for strategic goal setting. I'll talk about the use in testing, which is development of new assessment mechanism. And then I'll talk about use in teaching, which is its impact on classroom practice. And here I already put a question mark, so it's something that you can imagine what I'll be saying there. Now, when it comes to policy, the sort of main use of CEFR at the moment has been at the national level to specify expected proficiency targets for English. And you can see these on the right here. So these were the targets that were originally set. So A1 at the end of primary school, A2 in the third grade of secondary school, and then B1 in the final grade of secondary school. So that's sixth grade of secondary school, and also at bachelor's degree level, so undergraduate study. Yeah, so B1 sort of after high school or bachelor's degree study was kind of the expectation that was set for the education system. And this was, and going beyond the national level, it's also been quite widely used by universities. And I'll come back to this. It's really at the university level where CEFR has had the most impact in the Thai context. Now, I should note here, and the previous speakers have also pointed this out, that of course CEFR is a lot more than the levels. There is yes, these levels are kind of the most visible part, but there is a philosophy behind it. There is also a kind of way of teaching that is probably implied in these levels. And that kind of thing has seen a little bit less uptake. So it's basically been seen as, okay, we use these levels as a kind of common target, but basically map them onto the sort of approach that has been promoted for a couple of decades already, which is communicative teaching. So that's any kind of shift in overall philosophy hasn't really happened. And perhaps maybe it was worth pointing out that since CEFR was introduced, we haven't had a new basic curriculum for English introduced. So the curriculum is still from 2006, So it's and that's already was at the time, and it's still quite a progressive curriculum, which is stressing communication, culture, comparison, connection with other fields of study. So it is really actually there is a kind of profound compatibility with CEFR, but there hasn't been any attempt to map the two that I'm aware of. There is sort of this focus, let's say, especially on the levels, that's sort of the main thing. And here, I would sort of point out a little bit, as Prof. Tso mentioned, I am a discourse analyst as well. So I do sort of look at how is the CEFR talked about in these documents. And the sort of way that it's framed is often a little bit problematic from my perspective. Here I'm assessing, obviously. In the sense that the one thing is the goal setting itself is already driven by these discourses of development, of competitiveness that we often see in education, right? Where, policymakers look at other contexts and basically set goals because this other context that we aspire to be like sets this goal, and therefore we are going to set the same goal. So on this slide, right, you can see the way that the CEFR is being actually juxtaposed with PISA. Yeah, so PISA is this international literacy framework, that is sort of used basically to evaluate the success of education frameworks. And you can see basically, so for the 5-year periods that this education plan covers, right, the plan basically anticipates a kind of gradual increase of PISA scores, right? And when you look at the CEFR level, so at the beginning we have the targets that I showed before. So A1 for primary school, A2 for sort of middle of secondary school, and then B2 even here for kind of end of education, end of higher education. And basically then, it follows the model of the PISA scores, where it's basically seen as, okay, we are going to have an increase of these English proficiency within the same period. Yeah. And this is, basically following this the kind of anxiety that exists in discourse around education, very similar to what happens around PISA. Whenever the score comes out, it kind of, in many contexts, triggers this kind of panic, right? And we have actually very similar kind of features in the around English also in Thailand, where, when comparisons of English proficiency come out on a yearly basis, you will have a lot of media coverage saying, why is English proficiency so poor? What's wrong with our education system? That sort of thing. Based on this idea that, well, we should be, targeting the same levels as we see in, Sweden or Singapore, successful education system, like in more developed nations. But of course, this all has a very questionable sociolinguistic basis, because compared to those contexts where English proficiency at the exit of high school maybe is B2 sort of nationwide, right? The presence of English in Thai public sphere, in the cultural life of Thai, the average Thai high school student is much lower. Yeah, especially when we go out of big cities like Bangkok, when we go out of tourist areas like Phuket, the presence of English is much, much lower, is in many cases near zero. Yeah. And the actual achievement, of course, is much below even the targets that are set for now. Yeah. I mean, the majority of students at our university will come at, level A1, A2 to university level after 12 years of compulsory English education. Yeah. So there is a kind of split here between aspiration and reality that sort of CEFR is kind of entangled with. In not only Thai context, I've done research on the Malaysian context, and there are similarities between the two. Just pointing out, right, that's, following this, actually now the authorities have also revised targets. So this policy that you see here is all in Thai, but if I translate, right, it's basically from this year, they published these new targets where, okay, if you are doing associate's degree, you should target B1. If you're doing bachelor's degree, you should graduate with B2, bachelor's degree in any field. So engineering, natural science, whatever, Thai language, even graduate degree C1. Yeah. And this is the sociolinguistic basis, of course, for this is very questionable. Yeah. I mean, if we look at the sort of history of CEFR, B1 is supposed to be, I can go live and perform basic functions of life in a society where this L2 is being used as dominant language. B2 is, I can study an undergraduate degree in, English, for example, if my level is English. That is kind of seen as the minimum for university student mobility. Yeah? The rationalization for these targets is kind of lacking, right? Why? Not to mention, of course, how. Yeah, but just pointing out why we should target these is kind of where problems are, where problems sort of emerge. When it comes to testing, is probably arguably where the impact of CEFR in Thailand has been greatest. So this is in the development of local admission and exit tests at universities. So just to give you a context for, in Thai context, for university admission at undergraduate level, there are sort of nationally administered exams that are available. But then when it comes to graduation requirements, like the one that I just pointed out to you, there is no, graduate exam that everyone would have to use. And also for postgraduate admissions, MA, PhD, right, there's no national mandate that you must use this test or that test, yeah? So you basically, institutions are free to choose whether they want to use local or international tests like TOEFL, ITP, and IBT, IELTS, TOEIC, these can be used. But of course, local tests are very often preferred because they are much cheaper for students, yeah? So, if you take a locally developed test, it might be, a quarter of the cost of doing IELTS, for example. So because of that, they are quite popular. And of course, this creates quite significant space for local agency because you see a lot of tests being developed in-house, yeah? So university staff, lecturers at, for example, my department, end up having quite a central role in interpreting CEFR because they end up being tasked with, develop a test which will cover this many levels in order for us to be able to use it for admission at graduate level or for, graduating students at bachelor's degree level as well. So here there's quite a lot of, there's probably the area where CEFR has sort of filtered through to the bottom of the, let's say, to the level of practitioners the most. So I'll just give you an example from my university. So we use a range of tests. As long as they are aligned to the framework, they can be used. But most notably, we have our own test called PSU TEPS, which TEPS stand here for Test of English Proficiency. And I'm actually part of the development team. So here, it's an example of where, once this CEFR policy came in, we really had to redevelop this test quite holistically. It wasn't a question of taking the old test and basically doing an alignment study, right? In this case, we actually recreated the test from scratch to align to A1 to B2 range because that was the policy orientation at the time. So we sort of reduced it to just 4 levels. And as part of that, we, the main thing was to move away from form-focused items. So previously there was a lot of focus on grammar. There was a lot of quite focus on linguistic knowledge, and then focus more on local and global comprehension in listening and reading. For practical reasons, that component of the test ended up still being multiple choice, but we tried to push it more toward really different types of comprehension, information processing, that sort of thing. And but then finally also the revised form of the PSU TEP also includes integrated listening and speaking and reading and writing components. Yeah, so one of the modules or 2 of the modules that you can take listening and speaking, you can take reading and writing, and these are really directly developed from the interaction scales that are contained in the framework. That's in our case, that was quite a holistic review. At other universities, maybe there's been a tendency to work from the tests that were already there and to design, to maybe reevaluate them a little bit, or to simply also do an alignment study, basically using CEFR as a kind of fixed scale of language proficiency, which, something that we can maybe discuss later, whether that's feasible or not. Now, as far as teaching goes, this is probably where CEFR has had a lot less impact in day-to-day practice, especially outside higher education. And here there's a range of factors. There's probably an already existing level of alienation between policy and practice. It's been termed reform fatigue because in the past there's been a tendency for when new governments come in, a new education policy will be launched, right, with big fanfare, but then when it actually comes to follow through, by that point maybe the minister has changed, maybe the high level administrators have been moved around in the Ministry of Education, and that follow through then maybe doesn't quite happen as systematically as one would have wanted. So teachers are kind of already used to this constantly incoming announcements of, we are going to change this, we're going to change that, and kind of develop a sort of resistance to that sort of as part of almost their professional identity. Yeah. There is also a kind of documented issue where many teachers lack instructional competence for delivering communicative lessons. And whether, communicative in very sort of narrow sense that we see it now, as it's articulated in global textbooks, or if we think of communicative, in bigger sense, task-based learning, that kind of thing. All that kind of, that's a documented issue that very often teachers struggle with the idea of designing lessons. And in here, really, there is a kind of gap that still needs to be addressed even after quite a long time. This is something that's been written about in the literature for quite a while. Probably, and this is another point for discussion, is that CEFR itself is quite unsuitable, I think, for practitioner readers outside higher education, people who are teaching 25, 30 hours a week, who, don't have time to engage with that huge document. It's in my understanding or my perspective, it does suffer from a little bit of a deficit in that sense. So there is really a need to think about how to communicate it better. And another issue is at all levels, reliance on global textbooks or sometimes local textbooks or adapted textbooks as authoritative representation of curriculum policy or CEFR. So in the sense that, if the learning target is B2, you simply choose a textbook which correspond to B2 and follow whatever is in it. Yeah. That sort of is an issue that really very often practitioners' contact with CEFR is kind of secondary. Yeah, that really what they are looking at is curriculum targets, policy targets, and then looking at textbooks that are claimed to be aligned to the framework, right? And basically using those as, okay, this means I am conforming to the curriculum goals or the text or the policy goals or let's say local policy goals or whatever. There's also, of course, a kind of further issue with this disconnect, which is that partly, the alienation that teachers might have to CEFR is the way that it was introduced was a little bit unfortunate, which is through nationwide compulsory testing of teachers, kind of coming as part of this discourse of, teacher proficiency in language is low, therefore we must, we have to test them, and then we have to give them almost like remedial activities to be able to teach properly. And the resulting perception basically was that CEFR is basically just a test. Yeah. And in some cases, looking at some of the research that you can see cited here, actually there is a test where that C at the beginning stands for Cambridge. Yeah. The results of this testing, by the way, also show that there is quite a significant challenge. So you can see in the slide here, big majority below B1, which is, kind of, you would think kind of the minimum for let's say, really flexible communicative teaching, right? And a vast majority, 93 to 94% below B2, which is actually the official requirement that was stated at the time. And this is quite, a sobering picture to see, and it shows really the disconnect between, again, right, the policy targets and the sociolinguistic concept. Yeah, this is not because, these are lazy teachers or whatever. This is because sociolinguistically English does not play the role, a significant role in the context around these people. Yeah, that's the reality. Yeah. So I'll finish the last 10 minutes. I'll talk about what are the areas that also need further attention and sort of suggest a couple of things where applied linguistics can sort of help, and also teacher education can kind of help move the way that we use CEFR on. I'll talk about two problems in particular, which is the lack of holistic focus on philosophy when we're using CEFR. So the tendency to adapt it to fit existing concepts rather than rethinking them. And I should say here, I do of course believe that we have to adapt CEFR, and I will talk about that too. But of course, it should serve as a kind of vehicle for some kind of holistic changes as well. Yeah. And the other problem I'll talk about is the split between theory and policy and practice on the other hand. So how we can, try to resolve this ongoing alienation between official discourse and realities of teaching and learning. So when we talk about the philosophy behind CEFR, right, it's now, originally, looking at that original document, there was a lot of information already there. And this has sort of continued to be developed in recent years. The sort of particularly the name that has been given to this, if you look at this book by Enrica Picardo and Brian North, who are the main authors of the CEFR companion volume, they talk about CEFR being as part of the action-oriented approach. Yeah, and when they talk about the action-oriented approach in this book, they talk about it as oriented toward or underpinned by things like task-based language teaching, focus on authenticity, focus on autonomy, learner collaboration, but really also, not only classroom-based, but which somehow correspond to actions that you are performing in real life outside of the classroom. This is where probably there is quite a continuing deficit, and not really only in Thailand. Yeah, it would be unfair to say that this is only a Thai problem. This is really a bit of a worldwide issue, yeah, where we tend to see the CEFR as a kind of generic assessment or goal-setting framework that is basically a universal scale for language proficiency from 0 to 100, right? Where still, even today, I think people interpret the top as, okay, this is native speaker proficiency, even though the type of literacy that we see at C2 level far exceeds the kind of literacy that, your average British or American or whatever speaker of English does in their life. Yeah, there's a vastly broader and much more specialized scope. And aside from that, also, just thinking about what is the context of these levels, right? This is really quite a significant issue. So very often they are seen, okay, well, we just take these levels and, plug them into the communicative language teaching model that we've been promoting for the last 20, 30 years. Even in some cases, form-focused approaches get justified. So even, it's possible to find tests which are basically, where you have grammar components that claim to be, okay, well, we're doing, 30 items of grammar, vocabulary, and reading comprehension, and this is mapped to CEFR from A1 to C2. Those kind of examples can even be found. So here, there's a need to have a kind of reflective approach to the framework. Yeah, the heritage of how the CEFR was introduced in Southeast Asia, certainly in Thailand, also in Malaysia. The way that it arrived here was not through, let's say, applied linguistics research. It was not through starting with teacher education or teacher training. It was very much through commercial textbooks, commercial tests, Cambridge textbooks or Oxford University Press textbooks, and IELTS, TOEFL. Yeah, that was how the CEFR entered here. So it's very much seen as, we must adapt to the model that comes from those textbooks and tests. And of course, there is also an underlying issue of how do you create authenticity? If the presence of English in the Thai language ecology is so low, and this is, not only, again, a problem of Thailand, but also of other ecologies in Asia where, we are using CEFR for English, does that mean that, whatever we're doing in the classroom is by default inauthentic? because in the end, our learners aren't doing that in English, right? So how do we then establish some kind of sense of authenticity? This is quite a challenging issue. So I would just point out, right, one of the areas where you can see this lack of reflection is how people talk about 4 skills. So, the 4 skills of CEFR are reception, production, interaction, mediation, yeah? But actually, when it comes to the way that these skills are presented often can be very different. So there might be, placement tests which include grammar, right? There might be exams that talk about writing, but actually what it is error identification, so you have a sentence and you have to identify where the error has happened, something like that. So in the end, there's quite a lot of a gap here. So this is where we really need to be developing, really need to be exploring new paths, right? For developing, for targeting interaction competence, for example, as we did at PSU, is something that we need to do also for mediation, especially plurilingual mediation. Yeah, that's the sort of aspiration of mine, to try and integrate that into the test. But of course, we need to think about how we can focus more on authenticity. How we can embrace a much more ambitious task-based approach, as opposed to these soft versions of communicative teaching that we see often in textbooks. Just going back to this second issue, which is the lack of reflection on plurilingualism and pluriculturalism, what these actually are supposed to mean. So actually from the 2020 companion volume, these are now very explicitly operationalized. But we seem to be operating on the assumption worldwide, not just in Thailand, but also when it comes to IELTS, when it comes to textbooks, that, we don't know what to do with that plurilingualism. So we don't really have, we don't really have anything to do with it. So we do need to think about this, in the end, this comes from very significant policy concern that Prof. Tono already mentioned at the beginning, which is, in Europe, this focus on integration, So in Europe, this is expressed nowadays in the policy of teaching L1 plus 2 others, right? So proficiency in the first language and 2 other languages, that is the European Union learning goal. But of course, in Asia, we really need to think about how we can sort of grow, how we can help this kind of integration, because it is happening in the end, right? We are sort of becoming closer. There is more migration happening. And we really do need to think about how we can equip citizens to participate in integration. Do we, by necessity, need to focus only on English as a lingua franca, or do we need to think beyond English? Do we need to sacrifice all other languages and, focus on this bilingual agenda that we see throughout the continent now? Or can we use them in a kind of beneficial way? Yeah. And aside from that, do we need to think beyond, a single form of English and think about diversity of English? These are big questions that we need to answer in relation to the way that we also use CEFR. So we just need to think, how can we introduce more agency to try and address this split between theory and practice? We need to think about how we can use it as a vehicle for practitioner agency, right? How we can work within the professional culture and practical constraints. But really the precondition is we need to think, as a sociolinguist here, I'm talking, about how do we need to relocalize this policy for English language education in Asia? So context for CEFR in Europe is, I am a Slovenian going to Austria, Germany, or Switzerland, and I'm going to use German there. So I'm using my L2 in that L2 dominant society, right? But in Asia, what we're talking about is I'm going to be using the L2 in an L3 dominant society. So I'm, a Thai person going to Taiwan, and I'm going to use English there as a lingua franca. That is a very different learning goal, and we do need to think about what other skills are not covered by the CEFR that we need to target. In addition, we can also complicate it by saying that English in some Asian societies is a local language. In Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, but in different form than described in CEFR. So the kind of language use that we see described in that framework doesn't really match the uses of English as a local language in those contexts. So that's another challenge that we need to, where we do need to think about the future. So, 3 key takeaways. It's not a standard for evaluating development, even though it's often interpreted that way. We need to find ways of integrating it in practice, not only in objective setting, if it's to have an impact. And this, I think all other speakers have said this. And we need to use it as a starting point to explore new approaches, not only to reinforce old ones. That would be sort of the 3 key takeaways that I hope you will get from the talk.
Thank you, Professor SAVSKI. Very insightful speech. We are now waiting for invite questions from the participants. I guess while waiting for their writing, can I take the liberty of asking the first questions? Yeah, well, basically, I'm interested to your takeaway, and I'm thinking about to conclude the morning sections. If you have to pick to localize the European framework, CEFR, to the local context and adopt it and create another one, so for example, like CEFR Taiwan, and the other will be coming, inspiration coming from your talk. And instead of adopting or creating a new one, maybe the changing of the philosophy of language teaching, meaning redesign the national curriculum for English language teaching. So I'm asking, you, which one, if you have to pick, which one would you suggest us to go first? Thank you.
Well, thank you. One thing that I didn't mention is that in Thailand, we also have localized framework based on CEFR. And it kind of tried to implement some of these ideas. But the problem there was, and I think this is the general difficulty with localized versions of CEFR, is that it's hard to imbue them with the same level of authority that people attached to CEFR originally. So, like, looking at that, I have to say 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, make, CEFR Taiwan, yeah? But my sense now is probably we're better off, because if the main reason for having CEFR is because it's, has this international comparability, right? That we can, connect targets, this kind of thing. Maybe, having a kind of companion to the companion, yeah, would be the way to go, where it's basically, okay, this is how we are going to interpret it, yeah? This is what we're going to think of in addition. This is what we're going to ignore or shift, right? And that is going to be our sort of localized, let's say, interpretation manual or however it would be called. In the end, you get the benefit there of, okay, you're using CEFR, and you can map back to those to the levels that are used internationally, but at the same time you can use them internally. Yeah. So I think, and of course that kind of guide can then serve as the basis for adaptation, for curriculum development. Yeah, to set curriculum targets.
Interesting. Localized companion guide for designing national curriculum guideline.
Yes, that's fun.
Yeah. Would you take a look at the chat room? I think there's a questions for you.
Yes, I've got the question here. So could you elaborate how it was aligned to the CEFR, whether teachers achieve training before participating? Yes. So let's say in our case, we have quite a small team. It's only 4 of us working, and the head of the team is the language testing expert, right? Who had previously done research on language education, yeah, or on language testing, excuse me. So actually her previous project had been to develop integrated tasks, and she then basically was able to carry on that expertise into the development of the PSU TEP, yeah. So let's say the solution was for us, we all have to learn. I mean, for me as a sociolinguist and kind of at that time looking from CEFR from the outside, actually, of course, it was a huge learning experience, yeah, to work with that. Yeah, and it was challenging because in the end, the CEFR's advantage and disadvantage is vagueness. That in the end, they are quite broad things, and you really do need to think when it says, can read the text on everyday matters, you really do need to think, what does that mean and then what kind of language, what kind of question you need to ask. So there is a lot of expertise, a lot of contextual knowledge that needs to come in order to make it feasible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have 1 minute remains. Professor SAVSKI, enough for one more question. So you want to give us some suggestions for, the possible implementations or possible adaptations of CEFR in Taiwan?
I think that, if there's a space for applied linguistics expertise to play a role in that interpretation process, that's really and that, you can see from Tono's presentation that in Japan, that really made a difference, that in the end, there is a sustained participation of experts in the way that is being interpreted and used, and also kind of agentive participation, not simply, passive following. I think that's really the key. Yeah. So to this localization. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I think it's a big issue. Actually, it's a huge issue that we need to really put a lot of thinking on it. But thank you very much for sharing your insight, comments and findings. Thank you very much. And I think
very much. My pleasure.